Wow. I'm speechless and I got to talk for the next 60 minutes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kenrick Bagnall. I have three objectives today. I want to raise your awareness when it comes to this thing of cybersecurity and cybercrime. I want to share my perspective on it, not change yours, because yours is going to be made up of your work, your life experience, your background, your colleagues, interactions, everything else, and inspire some action. And I hope between the three speakers today, you're going to leave the conference today all excited about the new things that you've learned and really wanting to take some action, because otherwise it's a day off work and some really good food. Everybody enjoy lunch? Lunch is pretty good. Yeah, give it up for Wolfgang Puck. So nothing wrong with that. I've done a lot of speaking after lunch, and I tend to find that the quality of my presentation somehow parallels the quality of the food, so I really hope the meal was good. I really hope the meal was good. So this is the second annual for this conference, and I've been privileged to be invited back this year now. Was anybody here last year? Show of hands. And you guys knew I was coming and you still came. Thank you. Thank you for coming back. I feel like if you have that niece or nephew that you haven't seen for about a year, and then you see them and you see how much they've grown, you know, that's how I feel about this conference. Coming back a year later, and I see the size of this room, and I see how things have grown and improved, and there's so many more of you, I'm really inspired, because this is a challenge. I told you about my goals, and my goals are really going to reflect around this thing called cybersecurity as a subject matter, but it's a team sport. This thing of cybercrime didn't evolve in a vacuum, and as a problem, it's not going to be solved in one either. And we're all going to have to try to work together to figure this thing out. I want to quickly thank Dennis and Dan and Jim and the entire GCNE team for having me back. It's truly an honor and a privilege, and I'm humbled by it. So what we're going to do is I'm going to share a little story with you today that I'm calling The Anatomy of a Cyber Attack. The talk in your brochure is entitled Cyber Risk Assessment. Well, that's really scratching the surface. We're going to talk a little bit about the threat assessment, but then what we're going to do is we're going to get into a scenario of a data breach against a company, a pretty large organization that's based here in Atlanta. And then we're going to talk about the incident response. Now, the incident response is extremely, extremely important. You've heard people talk about, the previous speakers talk about targeted attacks versus random attacks, and the reality is that if you're targeted as an individual or as an organization, you are done. There is no system, no network, no security mechanisms that are completely infallible. So we know that billions and billions of dollars are being spent globally on cybersecurity and cybercrime prevention, and that's going to continue to happen. But organizations really need to take the time to focus on incident response. Have that mindset, as we've heard already, of when, not if. Not when will I be breached. Not if I will be breached, but when. It's going to happen. So that mindset changes everything, and you focus on your incident response. You build a proper plan, and just like back in the day when the big talk was all disaster recovery and business continuity, it was no good. Your last backup is no good unless you can actually test it. The incident response is no different. You have to test it. So by way of an outline, I'm going to try and do a little bit of a background, tell you a little bit more about myself and my agency and what we're doing. We're going to talk about the threat assessment. We're going to look at the breach against this corporation. And we're going to talk about the incident response. And through the whole thing, I'm going to try to leave you with what I call perspective points. Things that you can take away, take them all, take none, take one, and just really drive into it. And hopefully it'll help you round out some of the things that you're doing within your organization in terms of building your own incident response plans. I am a sworn law enforcement officer, and I investigate cybercrime. So ladies and gentlemen, that makes me a cyber cop. My son, my youngest son, when I joined this unit about 3 years ago, my son said, well, what are you going to be doing? I said, I'm going to investigate some internet crime and technology-related offenses and things like that. And he said, Dad, you're going to be a cyber cop. And I thought for a second, that's pretty cool. That is pretty cool. And then we're going to just round it out with some closing arguments and really see where this whole teamwork thing of working together to solve the cybercrime and cybersecurity issue really comes from, and what we have to do to work together to solve it. So I talked about in my goals about trying to share perspective. Now, if I'm sharing my perspective, I want to tell you a little bit about what my perspective really is. And I see it through two lenses. I don't just see it as a police officer. In 2006, I had the great opportunity to change careers at 42. I was a 42-year-old rookie in a class of 160 recruits, and that was fun. They had some age-related nicknames they made up for me. I won't share them with you right now, but it was great. It gave me an opportunity to learn something new. Before then, I'd never fired a firearm. You know, they teach you about the provincial statutes, all the criminal code things, and then they put you out there with a coach officer, and there you are, fighting crime. And I tell you, before this job, I always respected law enforcement. And after 12 years of doing this job, I can really understand it a lot better. And you know, to our members of law enforcement that have taken the time to come today, you know, from your brother law enforcement officer in the north, thank you for your service. It's really, really appreciated. I always talk about the 10 times demographic when it comes to Canada and the United States. You have about 10 times the population. You have about 10 times the crime. You have about 10 times the guns that we have up there. But I can tell you that you guys, the job you do, you are 10 times the law enforcement officer I could ever be. So I applaud you for the work that you do. Before becoming a police officer, I was this guy. That's me in 1987, and y'all are trying to do the math now. He was a rookie in 06 at 42, and I'm a techie at heart, and that's where the dual lens comes from. When I investigate a cyber incident, I don't see it just as an officer who's trying to investigate a criminal offense. I also see it as a technologist because that's the core of my background, that's the strength of my background. So that's the perspective that I'm going to try to share with you today. So a little bit about our unit. Our unit started actually about 5 years ago when the command decided, well, we have central investigation for robberies, we have central investigation for sexual assault, for homicide. We need centralized investigation to investigate this evolving thing called cyber. And how are we going to do that? So they started a project called Project Reboot. And what Project Reboot did, it took a look at the criminality that was happening, the fact that a lot of it was moving online, the fact that the internet space, which is both omnipresent and ubiquitous, was giving criminals an opportunity to get access with the click of a mouse or the push of an enter key, access to potentially hundreds of thousands of victims, and we've seen that quite prevalent in the child exploitation space. Before the unit was formed, if you were the young investigator in your divisional unit, or in New York they call it precinct or whatever, but your localized law enforcement area, if you were the investigator who was really good at Word, PowerPoint, and Excel, you were like the Microsoft Office guru, you became the cybercrime investigator. It was either that or you get the 30-year-old detective who the last time he wrote a report, he was on a typewriter. So they needed some skills. And our mandate initially was to investigate criminal offenses where there was a technology component connected to it, where it's a regular criminal code offense, but perhaps there was an internet component, there was a mobile technology component, there was some sort of technology piece to it. And that was one pathway that we took, as we were supporting all of the other units. The other pathway that we are taking more frequently now, because it's being reported to us more, was the actual technology as a target offense, where the actual data, the personalized, identifiable information, the medical records, the financial information, the actual true data breach is the other pathway, and we're doing a lot more of that now. So what's really important? The underlying theme to the whole conference is protecting what's important. So what's important to you? What are the things that matter to you? We're all very different. We come from different backgrounds. I had the pleasure of working with an officer for a couple of years. Him and I were very different. We didn't have the same religious beliefs. We didn't like the same music. We didn't like the same food. But after working with him for 2 years, I discovered that him and I had more in common than we did that were different. And if you look around the room, you only have to think about the history going back to '99, Columbine, Sandy Hook, Stoneman Douglas, and every one of those incidences in between. And it doesn't take long to figure out what some of the things are that are really, truly important. So if things are really important, let's talk about the risk assessment. Let's talk about what's important to you as an individual. Let's talk about what's important to your organization. What are the assets? Are you in education? Is there R&D? Is it the intellectual property? Are there patents pending that are important to you that you're trying to protect within your organization? You have to figure out what they are. You have to assign some sort of value. Everybody's getting cyber insurance these days. You want the actuaries and the insurance companies to tell you what your stuff is worth? You need to figure that out first before you take that step. The whole actuarial science arena is still in flux trying to figure it out because it's so new. There's so much volatility. If you don't believe me, just take a look at a chart of cryptocurrency and see where that's going, and you'll realize how much volatility there is out there. So understand what your assets are, put some proper value on them, and document them. Because if you don't, that'll happen. In an instant, I purposely did not transition this slide. I wanted to make it quickly because that's how quick it can happen. Those crown jewels within your organization, if you're not paying proper attention to them, they'll be up in flames. Depending on how malicious the attack is, perhaps quite literally. More often figuratively, but perhaps quite literally. And it's going to be because of a malicious attacker. And the previous speaker showed a picture of a stereotypical hacker, and I can tell you from experience that it is so true. There's really no such thing as a stereotypical hacker or attacker anymore. It is an equal opportunity criminal offense. In our experience, we've debriefed them as young as 14 years old, and it's startling how brilliant they are, how crafty they are. From there all the way up to nation state and everything in between. We're a municipal law enforcement agency. We're about the 4th or 5th largest in North America, behind the likes of New York and LA and I think Philadelphia and Dallas. And the order is in flux, but we're a pretty big agency. Our largest partner, and I was speaking with someone earlier about this, our largest law enforcement partner is the FBI. We're doing work with them all the time. I love those guys, they're great. We had a case recently that came out of the FBI field office in Chicago. There was a hacking group that attacked some infrastructure there. There was actual data exfiltration. There was some cyber extortion elements that were involved as well. And one of the targets was in our jurisdiction. So the FBI guys actually took the time and flew up to Toronto and did the takedown with us and executed the search warrant with us. It was great. It was brilliant stuff. We really enjoyed it. So let's look at some of the threat considerations. There are countless models out there in open source for doing threat assessment and risk assessment. So why reinvent the wheel? What I've tried to do for you today is I've taken a base model of a threat assessment and I've added a few things, and there's 2 areas I'd like to highlight. So let's go through it. The first area would be system susceptibility. From an attacker perspective, it is the value of those crown jewels and the vulnerabilities that exist in terms of protecting them. This is why you have to know what those assets are worth to you. Because you can believe that those attackers, those nefarious actors who are trying to get access, they know what it's worth. They know what it's worth. Whether it's a way to monetize the data that they're going to exfiltrate, or it's the reputational damage that could be done to your organization that we can't even put a number on. I know Target's still in business down here, but they're out of business north of the border. They suffered. They suffered greatly. And here's the interesting thing too, and this is not just a US or North American statistic, this is also in the UK as well. In terms of small to medium-sized businesses that become victims of successful cyber attacks, somewhere around 55% of them are out of business within 6 months. And if that statistic is not startling enough, take into account the fact that for both the United States and Canada, small to medium-sized businesses are making up anywhere from 53 to 55% of the GDP. So for a nation state that's going to be attacking these size organizations to do economic disruptive damage, think about what would happen if a large percentage of small to medium-sized businesses were attacked en masse. Huge impact to the economy, huge collateral damage. Let's try that again. There we go. Threat accessibility. This talks about the convergence. It's not a four-letter word. I think it's a good word. It's a good word. How physically protected are those assets that you've identified? What type of security do you have? Being an old networking guy, I always think of the wiring cabinet or the wiring closet. Is it open? Is it a physical lock? Is it an electronic lock? Are there cameras in the hallway monitoring? Because as fancy and as sexy as Hollywood might want to make cybercrime, it's really not. It really isn't. It's criminality just in a different place. And I can tell you, after doing this specifically for 3 years, that there's not one case that I've investigated where at some point did we not have to do boots on the ground police work. At some point we got to look at surveillance video. Right? At some point we have to look at the access control logs. Is there anybody here who works in HR within their organization? Don't be shy, just put your hand up. No one. I've been doing presentations on cybersecurity and cybercrime for 3 years, and only one time did someone from HR show up. And that's because somebody else couldn't go, so they went. And I can tell you, when there's a cyber incident at an organization, and we have the privilege of being invited to the table, that is law enforcement, HR is one of the first people that we want to talk to because they have most of the information that we need in terms of investigating a cyber threat. So when you go back to your organizations, talk to your HR people and tell them they need to come to the next one of these things. Threat capability. What are the tools they're using? What are the techniques? What kind of training do they have? I'll tell you one thing they do have. They've got time. All these T's, they have time. It's difficult to compete against the Ferraris, as mentioned before. It's really difficult to compete against that kind of stuff, especially when you're working for law enforcement and your public sector and your budget is scrutinized by the public and by the city. How are my team and I supposed to be able to combat cybercrime when we're competing against nation states in some cases that are recruiting the best and the brightest, the most talented? It's a huge, huge challenge. So let's look at these three things, and let's look at the intersection point. And you'll notice on the right side, that last one, you have zero control over that. You have zero control over the threat capability, zero. But let's look at the intersection of susceptibility and accessibility. You can no longer think of your organization in isolation. Who are you connected to? Who are you sharing information with? Is it another government agency? Is it another partner? Or maybe you're on the downstream side. Maybe you're a service provider to somebody else, and you have credentials to get into their system. We have to think about the connectivity piece. On the other side, you can do the best job you can at penetration testing. You have the best configuration on your firewall, your intrusion detection, your access control. Everything is working great. To this day, we still know that the weakest chain in the weakest link in the chain of cybersecurity is the human being. To this day, to this absolute day. I can tell you, after 2 years of being a fraud investigator, I don't care who you are, if you have a pulse, you have a vulnerability. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. I did a fraud investigation one time. A female was the victim. She had an MBA, super brilliant. She had just gotten out of divorce. She got her money from the house of the sale of the house, and she bought a condo, and she was trying to figure out what she was going to do with the rest of her life. She got taken for about $150,000. Brilliant woman, super smart, super intelligent. But she had a vulnerability. We all have vulnerabilities. We're human. And that's that one individual in your organization who's gonna sink your battleship, if I could say that, right? And you know who they are. They're the one that they do not practice good cyber hygiene. They'll be wearing the Armani suit. She'll be wearing the Christian Louboutin shoes, and she'll have the Louis Vuitton bag. Everything will be tight and right, and everything will be so polished on that individual. Yet they are the same person who will put a Post-it note with their password right on their desk. Zero cyber hygiene. Zero cyber hygiene. It amazes me the amount of companies that would take the proper step of doing penetration testing, but explicitly say to the company, I'm sure you've seen this, don't test our people. You can pound the crap out of our firewall. Do not test our people. It makes no sense to me when that's the weakest link right there. There was a study that was done in the UK not too long ago. Organization, they had penetration testing done, and then test our people. The return was somewhere around 60%. Almost 2/3 of their employees responded. They clicked. Almost 2/3. So what did they do for the next 6 months? Training, education, seminars, the whole thing. They brought the company back in again, test our people again, and it was cut in half, somewhere around 25 to 30%. The moral of that story is, I'm not a betting person, but I'd bet on that 25% any day compared to 60. You will never get that number down to 0. There will always be someone in your organization with that red circle around them. That's why we need to know who HR is in the organization, and they need to know everything that's going on within the organization. More on that in a bit. Because at the end of the day, that's what you're doing. You're trying to protect those crown jewels that you've identified and you've documented. So let's talk about the attack now. So this is what techtarget.com has to say what the attack is. The cyber attack vector. It's really the means by which to get into the system and get at those crown jewels, get at those assets. But here's the thing. I have this analogy that I use, what I call cyber attack snowflake. Now, every single snowflake is different. Every single one is different. Yet every single one is made up of the same thing. A couple of hydrogen atoms, oxygen atom. You think they'll all look the same. You think every cyber attack would look the same, right? The recon is the same. The tools that are out there are in the wild for anybody to get. You can even get cyber as a service. When the shadow brokers allegedly got access to the NSA tools and allegedly put them out there on the internet, it was going out there as a service, right? So why is every snowflake looking different? Because the temperatures are different, the wind directions are different. There's always a differentiating factor. Two organizations could both use Checkpoint as their firewall. I guarantee you they're not going to be configured the same, they're not going to be monitored the same, the skill level of the resources doing it are not going to be the same. There will always be differences. There will always be differences. So now let's talk about our target company now. This Atlanta-based organization called Global Corp. They're a fictitious company. I know you guys were thinking, somebody in Atlanta got hacked? Maybe they did, probably they did. But for the purpose of this exercise, we're going to talk about Global Corp. Technology-based manufacturing. They're global. They have to deal with time zones, multiple currencies, all sorts of issues. They're publicly traded, so there's some accountability issues there to shareholders. They have a lot of things going on. Mixed environment, Windows, Linux, Mac, and the dreaded, bring your own device. System admins, technology people, we hate that, don't we? We hate that. Bring your own device. So who are the players? Who are the players that need to be at the table? We're talking incident response now when you're trying to put this thing together. Every organization is going to be different, but at a baseline level, these are some of the people that you need. You need to have legal involved. You need to have your network and information security involved. Does the CEO need to be involved? Absolutely. Your CEO is the name and face of your organization. They need to be involved. Maybe not on a granular level on a day-to-day basis, but they need to be involved. You also need somebody called a breach coach. You need a quarterback. You need somebody to run this thing. When you get compromised, who's going to run it? Who's going to be the central point of decision-making? Your breach coach also needs to be external to your organization, and preferably somebody in the legal field. They're going to be able to decipher the language in terms of policy and regulatory compliance and all of these other issues that you have to deal with. preferably somebody external, and preferably somebody legal, in the legal business. Because here's the problem. If you take your internal counsel and you make them your breach coach, and your company gets hacked, and it is not a civil matter, it becomes a criminal matter, and law enforcement comes in to depose and interview and debrief, you've completely lost any privilege within your organization. Because that internal counsel will be interviewed as if they're just a staff member. You have external counsel, your breach coach, you maintain privilege. Law enforcement, last on the list for a lot of reasons, but we'll get to that a bit later. This brings me to my first perspective point. True story, there was a baker in the United States who was interviewed, and he was asked about cybersecurity. What is cybersecurity to you? What does it mean to you? Is it important to you? And he said, cybersecurity, I bake bread. Cybersecurity is not an issue for me. I get my orders in from my customers. I fulfill them. I'm part of the supply chain. Should cybersecurity be important to him? All that order fulfillment is done electronically. It's all done online. Should cybersecurity be important to him? Absolutely. Example as part of this perspective point. You may or may not recognize this guy. I'll tell you who he is. If you recognize that last name, if you spoke to him early in 2013, he'd probably say the same thing the baker did. Cybersecurity doesn't mean anything to me, but yet he was a service provider for we know who. And we all know the story. Perspective point here, do not think that cyber is not important to you. Your mindset should be, cybersecurity is a big concern for me. I may just bake bread, but cybersecurity is really, really important to me. So now let's look at the attack. There's so many different types of attack. We talked about the attack vector snowflake. They're all different. They're all going to look different. Let's look at, we're going to look at one specific one. We're going to look at SQL injection. And I know about my colleagues, how often they see it. We see it pretty often. There's the definition from dictionary.com as to what SQL is. And why is it important? SQL is the language that manages databases. And databases are important because that's where your information is. That's where your social security information is. That's where your investment information is if you're with McKinsey or Schwab or whoever's managing your money. That's where it all is. That's why it matters. Open Web Application Security Project defines SQL injection as this. And a quick sample of what the code might look like for my fellow nerds out there. That's it. It's basically taking a selection of whatever's being inputted, it's going to where the passwords are being stored, and it's returning anything as valid. So you can put garbage in and you'll get access, simply put. So now the attack has been discovered. And how is it discovered? Database administrators who know the table schema inside and out discover there's a table there that's not part of the documented structure. An anomaly, yes, but we have a protocol in place because we have an incident response plan, so we're going to upline report this. We're going to report this to Network and Information Security and keep going from there. This brings me to perspective point number 2. And this is going to come across as an oversimplification, and this is something that sort of came to me probably about a year and a half ago. I shared it with Moses last year, and I think it's kind of proliferating, it's growing. You have to understand the balance and tranquility of what normal looks like. If you were administrating an intrusion detection system, if you don't know what normal activity looks like, you'll never know what abnormal activity looks like. And you say, well, I've got network management on my network, and it's going to notify me when this or that happens. We all know that the breaches aren't being discovered by systems, that are being discovered by human beings. So you have to understand what normal looks like within your organization. And that's just not the technology side. I'll go back to HR again. You have to know your people. You have to know that Joe, he leaves the office at 5 o'clock every day. All of a sudden, 7 o'clock, 6 o'clock, he's there, he's coming in early. Well, that's not normal. Next thing you know, Joe resigns. And nobody says anything. Hey, Joe was acting really weird before he left. You've got to understand what normal looks like within your organization. It could save your company, your small to medium-sized business, where if you get breached, you will be out of business in 6 months. Let's look at the forensics of the attack now. We're not talking physical forensics. We're talking the digital artifacts. What do the logs look like on your firewall? Are the things coming in from multiple addresses, or is it a single IP address? We know that there are new tables created in the database. What about Active Directory? Are there new accounts being created? All of a sudden, the firewall, the FTP server is showing abnormal activity, potentially data exfiltration. Within law enforcement, in terms of investigating, we have this thing that we call the constellation of events. If there is one thing that happens, like a table all of a sudden being created in the database that didn't exist before, but firewall looks good, everything else looks good, intrusion detection looks good, everything else looks good. That one anomaly is not going to really raise any red flags, but all of a sudden you have all of these things happening in succession, and you start looking at the timestamps, and that creation table timestamp matches an increase in activity on your firewall, which matches the creation of account in Active Directory. All of a sudden you have a constellation of events that should be raising massive red flags. So now you got to up it. Mid-level management, the CEO, they've got to know. They've got to know exactly what's going on. Which brings me to perspective point number 3. Now, within software development, whether it's product development, product launch, on the marketing side, there are always cycles. There are always cycles. And traditionally, and I'll speak to something like software development, you go through requirements gathering, you build a prototype, you build a beta, you go through unit testing, you go through these cycles. There's a specific unit within the cycle for security. Here's the problem. That paradigm needs to change because security needs to be considered at every step of the way. I don't care if you're launching a new product as a marketing department or your business is now moving from Atlanta to Florida and you're opening a new office there. And you have to plan everything around that. Consider security at every step of the way. And make sure you do a good job with your risk analysis. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a second. Keep security top of mind through every life cycle. So now we've got the incident response. This thing has gotten to the CEO level. We have your incident response. You brought your breach coach in, and there's probably at least 1 or 2 of you that are thinking, these guys have, Global Corp, they've just been compromised. The CEO has been notified, and all these people around the table look pretty happy. Don't they? They look pretty happy. They look content. And you know why they're content? They have a breach response plan. They have a breach response plan that's been put in place, that's been tested, and now there's an actual breach, and they're going through it. They're taking the steps that need to take. The players are being gathered, a damage assessment is being done, damage control is taking place. They know what's happening. Which brings me to perspective point number 4. I recently had the opportunity to work with the City of Toronto's Office of Emergency Management. They were going through what they call their HIRA, their Hazard Incident Risk Assessment. And they're looking at different things within the city that could shut things down, whether it's the power grid, water, power, transportation. They were prioritizing them in terms of importance. And this is an abridged version of their list. Their list had about 9 or 10 things on it, but indeed they did have a cyber attack on that list. And that's not Toronto, by the way, that's Atlanta. I'm sure you guys recognize that. I said, I can't use Toronto on a slide talking about city infrastructure. I'm going to use Atlanta, make it real. They had cyber on their list, and then they said, okay, they sent me a 100-page document. Can you look over this and come in and talk to us? We want to kind of go the next step in this. And I looked it over and I thought, wow, they had cyber on the list, but they're missing something. They're missing something huge. And what they're missing is that everything on their list had a cyber component to it. Everything on their list, right? One of the other speakers talked about the emergency system being jammed with fake. How are you going to dispatch emergency responders if your dispatch system is all of a sudden being jammed, right? Last year I had the privilege to be here. Last year we spoke about critical infrastructure and how it affects everybody. You have to be living under a rock not to be affected by critical infrastructure in some way, shape, or form. So it's short-sighted to think that there's no cyber component to things like power generation and fire control and insider threats. It's very, very short-sighted. Everything that you're doing within your city planning and your incident response, there is a cyber component to it. I'll give you case in point when it comes to the criminal side. There was a time where I thought, probably maybe 4 or 5 years ago, that for sure there's criminality that still exists that hasn't been influenced by technology or the internet. There must be something. And I look at our criminal code, and I look at all these different offenses, and I can tell you today, unequivocally, that there is not a criminal offense, street-level crime, that does not involve the internet or technology or some sort of component. We're all carrying mobile devices. We step out of our home, and within seconds, we're in shot of some sort of surveillance video, whether it's a private organization or it's run by the government. Even a theft under from Walmart is going to involve a cyber component, because that individual is probably carrying a mobile phone that's bouncing off of every Wi-Fi in the area. That MAC address is going to be in the log on that router, and they're going to be on surveillance video. Even a simple theft under, you cannot get away from it. It's everywhere. Absolutely pervasive, ubiquitous, it's absolutely everywhere. So let's look at the incident response for a couple minutes. The team has gotten together. Global Corp has been compromised. Now things start to need to start happening. You need to make a statement to the media. You should make a statement to the media, because you don't want them making it up in an age of Twitter and Instagram. You do not want them doing that. You have your prepared statement, your breach coach goes on camera, or your CEO, and they read that media statement. You're publicly traded. What's the report to the board going to be? You got to notify your staff members and your customers. Absolutely have to do that. In January of last year, Verifone got breached. Verifone, point-of-sale devices, largest manufacturer of point-of-sale devices in Europe, I believe the second largest in North America. They got compromised. And the chief information officer sent out an email to the staff saying, emergency request, everybody change your password now. You don't think people got suspicious that there might be something a little bit wrong with that? Their media spokesperson made a statement to the public saying, oh, it was our office automation day-to-day network that got compromised. There was no data exfiltration. Our production network, as far as our devices are concerned, was never touched. And the irony is, their media person is, his name is Andy Payment. And, well, somebody gets it at least. If you don't see the irony of a payment, a point-of-sale device manufacturer having a spokesperson with the surname of Payment, I don't know what to tell you. Let's continue looking at the list. You got to notify other authorities here. You got to notify your cyber insurance people. You got to contact credit reporting. You have to contact credit reporting. I can almost see how that would go. Yes, hello, Equifax. We've been compromised, and we're reporting a data breach, and as part of our incident response plan, and we're notifying you. And oh, what? You want me to hold? You guys are being breached yourself? Okay, I'll hold. I can see that happening. I can absolutely see that happening. But that's part of the protocol. You need to do that. You need to be fiscally responsible. You need to be accountable to your customers. Everyone knows what's happening May 25th of this year. If you do not know what's happening May 25th of this year, you should. General Data Protection Regulation for the EU. Every European Union citizen, their data must be protected regardless of the company that holds that data or where that company resides. In the EU or in Silicon Valley, it doesn't matter. It's going to affect you. It will absolutely affect you. And May's just around the corner. Perspective point number 5. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but perspective point number 5. 20 minutes. 20 minutes? Okay. You remember when you were a little kid in elementary school and they were picking sides, they were picking teams, and there was always that one kid that was left on the sideline, like this poor guy here. He was left on the sideline. Nobody wanted to pick him for his team. Maybe it was you. Maybe it was some other kid. I know depending on the sport, it was me sometimes. Well, that's law enforcement when it comes to cybersecurity and breaches. For not some reason, for a lot of well-known reasons. Are there any persons of interest? What happened to all the information that your cybersecurity company gathered when they came in and did mediation for you? What happened to all of that? Well, I can tell you something. If your company gets breached, if your company gets breached, and you follow your protocol such that it may be at the time, and you call in company XYZ to come and do mediation, figure out, how did these guys get in? Oh, this is how they got in? Let's plug that hole. Okay, we're good. No media statement? Nobody knows what happened? You've got a huge problem. You've got a huge problem if you're not involving law enforcement. You've got an absolutely huge problem if you're not involving law enforcement. Here's another reason why you need to involve law enforcement. We're public servants. We are absolutely public servants. And my unit used to have 12 people in it, and today we have 9. Our numbers are going down and our workload is going up. So if you're not reporting a breach, how can we say to command, look at all this stuff, we need more people? In threat capability, we talked about tools, techniques, training. How are we going to get that so we can combat that? We absolutely have to have that. So you're going to report something to law enforcement. How about post-incident? Does that make sense to do? Have you ever heard the term closing the barn door after the horse has already gotten out? That's kind of what that's like, you know, and I won't name any specific investigations. Ashley Madison. Did I say that out loud? Just
The mic was on.
my mic was on. Yeah, they came to us and said, can you help us, like 6 weeks or 8 weeks later? No. They paid millions of dollars to a cybersecurity company who came in, and I can talk about it because it's done. Came in and did all this great work, put together this great report, and that's what we like to call evidence. My friends in law enforcement at the back, isn't that what we like to call it? That's called evidence. And that's what we like to take to court with us. We like to put a credible case together that we can bring the Crown prosecutor on board, put it on their desk and say, this has a reasonable prospect of conviction. Are cyber criminals being penalized enough? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But if you tell me to build a house and you give me one guy with a rusty hammer, what kind of house are you going to get? You know, the job of law enforcement is to keep the peace and enforce the laws. Serve and protect is right in there, but we can only enforce what's on the books. And on top of that, if it is on the books, but the punitive side of it is weak, all we're saying is, cyber criminals, we're open for business. Because if you get caught, we'll slap you on the wrist. Maybe we'll hire you for 6 or 12 months because you got skills, you know. But that's why I like working with the FBI, because they don't play. They do not play at all. When the Chicago guys came up, they sat in on the interview because extradition was on the table, potentially. And do you think this guy was nervous? Do you think he wanted to be charged in Canada or the US? Yeah, you don't want to report post-incident. I mean, you could make it a matter of record, and we'll have something that says that you were breached 6 months ago, and now you're getting to law enforcement, and that's great. But it doesn't do the investigation any good. How about during the incident? How about during the incident? Your firewall logs are blowing up, you got system admins running around screaming, files are being deleted like crazy. It's a malicious attack. Boot records are being removed. Machines are being fried, literally. You think anybody's going to pick up the phone and call police? Hell no. Somebody's going to pick up the phone and say, get us up and running. Fix this now. Forget calling law enforcement. Obviously, when you want to do it, you want to do it pre-incident. You want to do it pre-incident. I mentioned Columbine earlier. Do you think there was active attacker training for law enforcement before Columbine? Do you think university campuses, college campuses, mall complexes, do you think they engaged in any type of active attacker threat assessment or mediation before that happened? Of course not. They didn't happen. They never did that. I can tell you it's being done on a regular basis now. And you know, I told myself I wasn't going to get political, but I'm going to get political for about 10 seconds because I think I have a little bit of time. If your president thinks that teachers should be armed in schools, I would only suggest that he goes to local law enforcement in the DC area or wherever he has property and go through an active attacker exercise with them. Go through an active attacker exercise with them, and then you decide if you want to put a handgun in the hands of the teacher. You know, I don't know. What's important, right? At the end of the day, what's really, really important? That's my last perspective point. Cyber incident law enforcement engagement, you have to involve law enforcement. They have to be part of your incident response. There has to be a checkbox there. Even pre-incident, just like any critical infrastructure or college campus would contact local law enforcement and say, we want to be involved in an active attacker exercise because we want to be prepared. Your organization needs to go to law enforcement and say, okay, if we're breached and there's criminality involved, because I can tell you most of it's going to end up in the civil court. And the civil court has a different threshold than the criminal courts. It's just on a balance of probability, so all you have to do in civil court is prove that you've made a reasonable effort. And what's a reasonable effort? We have disaster recovery plan that we've tested, we have penetration testing, we have an incident response plan, we have a breach coach, we've contacted law enforcement, and checkbox, 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 checkbox. We are good. You will survive any test in civil court. But let there be potential criminality, and you haven't got law enforcement involved from the beginning. You have a breach and you bring in some highly paid gunslinging cybersecurity expert. I'm not big on that word of expert because things change too quickly to be an expert, unless it's just within that specific time slice, right? If you're going to do that and you're not going to bring law enforcement in, you've got a huge problem. Because they're going to do all this great work for you, they're going to send you an invoice, and you've got all of this evidence that law enforcement will never get into the witness box and testify to. There's no chain of custody, there's no continuity to the evidence, there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing. Get law enforcement involved, and get them involved as early as possible. Because that's the end game for us, right? We catch bad guys. I told you at the beginning, my son said to me, Dad, you're going to be a cyber cop. Right? My goal is no different. My goal is no different than when I was in uniform when I was working on the road. You know, I catch bad guys. I catch bad guys and I put them before the courts. Simple. You know, I don't care if you've stolen a car or you've stolen someone's identity. It makes no difference to me. It makes absolutely no difference to me. I mean, there are obvious differences. You know, you chase a bad guy through a hallway, down a stairwell, over a fence in a backyard. Eventually, you catch them and they fight. They always want to fight. I don't know why they want to fight. You know. But within cybersecurity, we still have to chase them. We're chasing them through the dark web, through chat rooms, you know, through VPNs. We're still chasing them. You know, our goal at the end of the day is we have to put them behind the keyboard. And that's why convergence matters, because it's not just the Hollywood cyber investigation. You know, it's not just that, because there's still boots on the ground work that needs to be done. There's still interviews that need to be had. That case with the Chicago field office, where we got our guy, and I was talking about it at dinner. It was last night. It was kind of crazy because our surveillance was good, but we didn't realize that our guy had a younger brother that looked exactly like him. That can be a bit of a problem, but we ended up getting the right guy. We brought him in, and 45 minutes of deny, 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 deny. I didn't do it. But what he didn't know is that the FBI, from a previous target that was arrested, seized the laptop incident to arrest and retrieved an artifact in the form of an audio file that was a recording of the cyber extortion. And our guy had a very distinctive voice, and after 45 minutes of deny, 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 all we did was press the play button. And if you've ever seen a grown man cry, it's something to behold. It truly is. It truly is. But that's our end game. You can bring in cybersecurity to plug the holes in your network and solve the problem and change your procedures. You could train your people. You can do all sorts of great things. But wherein lies the punitive piece of that puzzle? There isn't one. In the absence of law enforcement, there absolutely isn't one. Do we need stronger laws? Do we need stricter penalties against cybercrime? Absolutely. Absolutely. Often I get asked, what's your success rate in the courts? I mean, you got matters going before the courts. What's your success rate? And I always answer that question the same way. You know, I always answer the question the exact same way. We have zero success with 100% of the cases that are not reported. That's where it starts, my friends. You have to get law enforcement involved. You pay your taxes, law enforcement serves and protects, not just in the physical world, but in the real world, but in the virtual world as well. So I want to leave you with this. Dr. Edmund Lockhart, he's been commonly known as the father of forensics. And he coined a phrase that says, every contact leaves a trace. And he coined that, you see the dates there, he coined that at a time long before the internet, or long before any type of technology that's involved with cybercrime, to talk about physical forensics, fibers, DNA, fingerprints, things like that. The same applies to cyber security and data breaches. It absolutely does. Even in the most destructive attacks where machines are destroyed, physically destroyed, there's still going to be traces. There will still absolutely be traces. It's going to be somewhere. The traces will be somewhere. You know, just like no system is completely infallible, even air gapping, I can tell you air gapping doesn't work. Air gapping does not work at all. I mean, that's what the Iranians tried to do in Natanz when they were trying to enrich uranium, and I spoke about that last year when we talked about critical infrastructure. That facility was air gapped, but still it was compromised. Air gapping doesn't work. I read something the other day about how they're now using the heat waves on temperature sensors to transfer data in between machines. My fellow speakers are nodding. Even air gapping doesn't work. It doesn't, right? But I can guarantee you that every contact absolutely, absolutely does leave a trace. Any of you all been whitewater rafting? Yeah, it's a lot of fun, huh? Of those of you who have just put your hands up, would any of you attempt whitewater rafting solo? Heck to the no. Right? You would not, it's fun, it's an adrenaline rush. And at the end of it, you're like, wow, yeah, let's do that again. But you would not attempt that alone. Why are you going to try and attempt cybersecurity mediation and solving this problem, this cybercrime problem alone? You can't. You absolutely can't. Doesn't matter if you're public sector, private sector, doesn't matter who you are. You cannot solve the problem alone. You have to get experts involved. You've got great vendors in the room here with great technology, great work experience. It's like I tell my kids. I tell my youngest, who's got so much potential, but he's at that typical teenage age where he's a bit of a knucklehead, but he still has potential. His older brother has a master's. My daughter in the middle is in her second year at university, and my youngest, he's just an absolute knucklehead. But he's and I'm kind of getting a little bit emotional about that. I'm kind of losing my train of thought at the end of my talk here. But the reality is, folks, you can't absolutely do this alone. You absolutely cannot do this alone, and you need to work together. Because if we work together and we share our expertise, I just remembered, thank God I remembered what I was going to say. I tell my youngest son, I said, between your mother and I, and now forget the math, you all got to know how old we are. I said, between your mother and I, we have 104 years of life experience. You are 17 years old. You are foolish not to tap into that life experience. You are absolutely foolish not to tap into that life experience. Folks, you are foolish if you're not tapping into these vendors and gaining their expertise and gaining their knowledge and applying it. I mean, I used to say, unless you're Cisco or Microsoft or Apple, where the technology is your business, all the technology is just a tool. That's all it is for your business. That's all it is. But you don't want the rusty hammer. You want good tools that work, that you can apply to your business. Talk to these vendors, talk to these people, get their expertise, get their knowledge, and share the information. Solving cybercrime, solving this issue of cybersecurity and cybercrime, it's a shared responsibility. It absolutely is. And together we can win. We absolutely can. But I'm here to tell you that we can't do it alone. We got to do it together. Don't white water raft alone, and don't try to solve this problem alone, because you absolutely won't. You guys have been a great post-lunch audience. I thank you for your time and your attention, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.